As the quiet night envelops the world, we begin a journey through one of the most ancient and timeless tales in Greek mythology, the story of Persephone, the goddess who walks between worlds, daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, and Zeus, the mighty ruler of the heavens. Persephone's story unfolds in the soft rhythms of nature, marked by the changing seasons and the eternal cycle of life and death. Her tale, though filled with loss and longing, is also one of growth, transformation, and the quiet power of balance. It is a story of descent and return, of light and shadow intertwined, echoing the delicate dance between the life-giving earth and the realm of the dead. From her childhood in the blooming fields to her fateful journey to the underworld, Persephone's myth is a reflection of the world itself, ever-changing, yet constant in its cycles. As you listen to the gentle unfolding of Persephone's journey, may you feel the peace of the earth beneath your feet and the soft passage of time. Allow the rhythm of her story to guide you, gently easing you into restful sleep. Before we begin, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share where you are listening from. Let us now journey into the quiet, timeless tale of Persephone. In the days long ago, when the world was young and the gods still walked among mortals, a child was born to the great goddess Demeter, the earth's nurturing spirit, and Zeus, the mighty ruler of the heavens. This child, Persephone, was destined to embody the harmony between the earth and the sky, between life and death. From her very first breath, she carried the promise of growth, renewal, and the eternal cycle of nature itself. Her mother, Demeter, delighted in the birth of her daughter. Persephone's beauty was unmatched, and her presence brought a gentle warmth to the world. The earth itself seemed to flourish under her steps, as if the land itself recognized the blessing of her life. Flowers bloomed in every field she walked, and trees grew tall and strong in her presence. Persephone was a child of the earth, her heart entwined with the very rhythms of nature. In the bright days of her youth, Persephone roamed freely among the meadows, playing with the nymphs and the creatures of the forest. The warmth of the sun kissed her cheeks, and the gentle breeze seemed to carry her laughter through the air like music. The earth whispered to her in quiet tones, teaching her the language of the seasons, of the stars, and of the land that sustained all life. Demeter watched over her with loving care, her heart swelling with pride for the daughter she had brought into the world. Yet, as the earth flourished around Persephone, there was a shadow quietly gathering at the edges of her life, an unknown force that would soon draw her away from the world she knew into the depths of the unseen realm. It was a quiet, inevitable turning of fate, the beginning of a story that would weave light and shadow together into an eternal dance. And so, Persephone lived, unaware of the darkness that would soon come, her world still bathed in the light of youth and the beauty of spring. In the early days of Persephone's life, the world was a place of innocence and beauty. She grew in the loving embrace of her mother, Demeter, amidst the endless expanses of fertile fields, where the earth seemed to smile beneath her feet. Demeter, the goddess of harvest and nourishment, nurtured her daughter with a care that made the very soil of the earth fertile and rich with life. Persephone, in turn, radiated a purity and grace that brought joy to all who beheld her. The sunlight that filtered through the canopy of trees danced around her as though nature itself celebrated her existence. From the moment Persephone could walk, Her small feet would wander through the lush meadows, playing with the nymphs, the spirits of the streams and forests, who revelled in her company. They would twirl in the fields, laughing with the wind that rustled the grasses and flowers. The animals, too, had a special affection for her, following her wherever she went, as if they too could sense the sacred bond between the girl and the earth itself. The flowers bloomed in her presence, their colours more vivid, their fragrance more intoxicating, as if they responded to the light that emanated from her. Every season brought a new burst of life to the land as she danced through fields of crocus, anemone, and violets, her every step leaving behind the warmth of spring. The very air around her seemed to shimmer with the magic of youth and life, her laughter filling the world like a song. The bond between mother and daughter was one of the deepest affection. Demeter, who had created the earth's abundance, showered Persephone with all the gifts of nature. They would walk together, hand in hand through the fields, and Demeter would teach Persephone about the plants, the seasons, and the cycles of the earth. They would speak of the stars and the gods, of the ancient rhythm that bound all things, the growth of crops, the ebb and flow of the tides, the warmth of the sun, and the coolness of the night. To Demeter, her daughter was not only a gift of love, but a living symbol of the earth's beauty and fertility. Under the tender care of her mother, Persephone grew strong and graceful, her beauty admired by all who laid eyes upon her. Yet there was a quiet strength in Persephone, a stillness beneath her youthful energy. While she revelled in the joy of her childhood, there was an inner knowing that one day her life would take a path beyond the warm embrace of the earth's surface. Even in those early days, the cycles of the seasons whispered to her, and though she could not understand the meaning of those whispers, they carried the weight of things to come. She was not just a child of spring, of warmth and light. She was also part of the eternal dance of life and death, of light and shadow. Each year, as the days grew longer and the fields swelled with the richness of summer, Persephone's sense of the world around her deepened. Her mind, like the earth she wandered, was fertile, and she learned quickly. Yet her true love was the carefree joy of her childhood, the warmth of the sun, the play of light across the land, and the companionship of the spirits who inhabited the earth's every corner. The nymphs, dryads, and creatures of the forest all felt a special bond with her. She was not merely a goddess, but a child of the earth in the truest sense, someone who could feel the pulse of life in every living thing around her. It was in these fields that Persephone felt closest to her mother and the world she knew, surrounded by the quiet hum of nature where time seemed to stretch, slow and flow like a gentle river. The flowers, the trees, and the creatures of the earth seemed to acknowledge her as their equal, a part of the eternal cycle that governed all life. But even in the most carefree moments, a feeling lingered within her, a quiet presence that was always with her, like the gentle breeze that would sometimes stir the branches overhead, whispering of things beyond the horizon. The days passed like a dream, each one blending softly into the next. Yet there was an underlying truth in the seasons that Persephone, even in her childhood, would someday come to know, that the world was never static. The earth, in all its beauty, was constantly shifting and changing, as were the lives of the gods and mortals. Though the days seemed endless in their tranquility, the passage of time was ever present. And in the back of Persephone's mind, there was a distant, unspoken awareness that the harmony of her life would not last forever. One of the most striking aspects of Persephone's childhood was her innocence. She was unaware of the forces beyond her control, of the darker, unseen forces that might someday call her away from the warmth of the earth and the safety of her mother's arms. Demeter, too, shielded her from such thoughts, hoping to protect her from the inevitable truth of her destiny, that the girl who walked in the meadows and danced among the flowers would one day be taken from the light, carried into a realm of shadows. But for now, the earth sang with her laughter, the skies stretched wide with promise, and Persephone's life remained intertwined with the beauty of the natural world. The sun, the wind, the flowers, and the trees, all were her companions, her friends, and her family. It was a time of perfect harmony, a time that could only be fleeting, for all things must change, and the earth must know both light and dark, just as Persephone herself would soon come to understand. As the earth's warmth spread over the lands and the days grew longer, Persephone's presence seemed to awaken something deeper within the soil itself. The land responded to her, its bounty growing richer with each passing day. The flowers, with their delicate petals, rose in great numbers as though they were responding to her very breath, stretching toward the sun as if to touch the purity and grace that radiated from her. Each blossom bloomed with colors more vivid than the last, and their fragrances filled the air like a soft symphony of nature's sweetest songs. Persephone herself was like the flowers she nurtured, full of innocence and potential, her spirit as vibrant as the blossoms that lined the meadows. She would often spend hours in the gardens and fields, gathering flowers to weave into crowns and garlands, admiring their colors and the way the light danced across their surfaces. The world seemed endless in its beauty, each day a repetition of the peaceful rhythm that came with the spring. But the earth, as much as it thrived in the warmth of the sun, was also governed by forces beyond even Demeter's understanding. As the flowers rose in abundance, so too did the darker elements of the world stir. Beneath the surface of the earth, there was a world far removed from the sunlight, a world that Persephone knew little of, but that would soon beckon her. The underworld, ruled by Hades, was a realm of shadows, far away from the sunlight of her youth, and it had begun to watch, to wait. Though Persephone's days were filled with the joy of growing and blooming, the underworld's stillness grew ever closer, like a distant thunderstorm that cannot be seen but can be felt in the air. In the weeks that passed, Persephone's days followed the familiar pattern of childhood, filled with laughter, play, and an endless connection to the earth. The flowers, ever more beautiful, seemed to rise with her every step. The crocus and hyacinth danced in the wind at her passing, the anemones opening their petals wide to the sun, and the violets carpeting the earth beneath her feet. Everything in the world she knew seemed to be a reflection of her own joy and beauty. It was a simple, perfect world, where every moment was an extension of the next, and time itself seemed to hold no power. And yet, for all the brightness that filled her days, there were those moments when Persephone felt the faintest shift in the air, an undercurrent of unease that she could not quite place. It was subtle, like the stillness before the storm, a deep breath taken just before something began to change. These feelings were not enough to pull her away from the joy of her days, but there were quiet, fleeting moments when she found herself looking toward the horizon, as though something was drawing her attention, pulling her thoughts to distant places she could not quite reach. There were whispers in the wind, perhaps from the earth itself, that reminded her of something unknown, something far below. But they were soft, imperceptible, and easily forgotten in the presence of the flowers that bloomed at her feet. Still, the earth remained a place of unbroken joy, the endless fields of flowers a testament to the harmonious balance between life and the seasons. Persephone's connection to the earth was inseparable. She was as much a part of it as the flowers and the trees, her energy and the earth's energy flowing together in perfect unity. The sun was her companion, the moon a distant, comforting presence, and the winds carried her name on their gentle breezes. Her relationship with her mother Demeter only deepened with time. Demeter, watching her daughter grow, found a profound peace in knowing that Persephone was so closely tied to the world they shared. Together, they cultivated the earth, bringing forth life in abundance. Persephone, the embodiment of spring's delicate beauty, worked alongside Demeter to ensure the prosperity of the land. They planted seeds, tended to the crops, and shared in the quiet joy of the earth's bounty. The bond between mother and daughter was as natural as the seasons, and their love for one another was reflected in the flourishing of the world around them. Yet, beneath all this beauty and harmony, there was the faintest trace of something different, something beyond the surface of the earth. It was a call, a silent beckoning from a place where light did not touch. The underworld, ancient and far away, began to stir, and Hades, its ruler, gazed upon Persephone with an unspoken desire. For while the earth above flourished in sunlight, the world below was cold and still. Hades, a god of shadows, longed for the vibrancy of Persephone's life, her youth, her beauty, her very spirit. He, who ruled over death and the afterlife, saw in her something that he could never possess within the dark and silent halls of his realm: the warmth, the brightness, the life of spring itself. And so, while the flowers bloomed in radiant arrays, and the earth sang with the joy of Persephone's presence, the stillness of the underworld grew ever nearer, silently preparing for the moment when its dark lord would reach forth and claim what he desired most. In the quiet corners of Persephone's mind, she felt these faint stirrings, these distant, hidden forces. But they were fleeting, like the gentle rustling of leaves in a distant forest. She could not know yet that her life, her joy, and the earth's beauty would soon be altered, that the flowers she loved so dearly would no longer be the only bloom in her life's journey. The warmth of the spring would be replaced by the chilling touch of the shadows, and her path would shift forever, not in one moment, but in a silent, inevitable descent that had already begun. For now, though, Persephone walked among the flowers, and the earth sang her name. The skies were clear, the fields full of life, and the world was at peace. The earth, in its deep wisdom, saw all things. It was the keeper of secrets, the silent witness to the passage of time. The soil beneath Persephone's feet knew of all that had come before and all that was to come. In the quiet hum of nature, the earth spoke in whispers, not in words, but in an understanding that transcended the limits of language. And in its ancient knowing, the earth had already sensed the change that was drawing near. It knew of the forces stirring in the depths, and it felt the shadow of the underworld creeping ever closer to the surface. As Persephone danced through the meadows, her laughter filling the air like the gentle tinkling of a bell, Demeter watched over her daughter with a vigilance born of love. The bond between mother and child was sacred, and Demeter, goddess of the harvest, had long protected Persephone from the darker currents that moved beneath the world's surface. The earth itself, though filled with bounty, was also a place of contrasts, a realm where life and death existed side by side, where the harvests grew only to be consumed by the cold of winter. And as the seasons turned, as the days grew longer and the flowers bloomed, Demeter knew that the earth's cyclical nature could not be ignored forever. Demeter's heart swelled with love for Persephone, but in the quiet spaces of her mind, a lingering sense of unease remained. She could feel the change that was coming, like a shadow on the horizon, an unknown force that was drawing near. Yet, like any mother, she shielded her daughter from such concerns. She wanted Persephone to enjoy the beauty of her youth, to live fully in the light of spring without fear of the inevitable turning of the wheel of time. Persephone, for her part, remained blissfully unaware of the hidden forces at play. She was a child of the earth, her connection to the land pure and unbroken. The world around her was a place of wonder, where every day was filled with new discoveries and every moment seemed to unfold in perfect harmony. She knew no fear, for the earth was her home, and the sun and the sky were her constant companions. There was no darkness in her world, only light, only life. But the earth had seen the coming storm, and in its silent, unspoken way, it began to prepare. Flowers bloomed more brightly, the wind carried a heavier scent, and the very soil beneath Persephone's feet began to shift. There was a tremor in the air, an invisible change that Persephone could not yet understand, but the earth felt it. And in its infinite wisdom, it knew that the time was drawing near for the balance to shift once more. In the distance, a new presence was emerging. Hades, the lord of the underworld, whose realm was a stark contrast to the lively earth, gazed upon Persephone from the shadows. His heart, cold and still, had long yearned for the warmth and vitality that Persephone embodied. Though his kingdom was one of silence and death, there was a part of him that desired the energy, the life that Persephone's presence brought to the earth. And in this desire, he saw an opportunity to draw Persephone into his dark domain, where light could not reach, where the seasons did not change, and where the earth's cycles were forgotten. It was in this moment that the earth, in its quiet, all-seeing way, began to understand that it could not protect Persephone forever. The forces of the underworld were too powerful, and the pull of Hades was too strong. The earth had seen this coming for ages, the inevitable moment when Persephone would have to leave the world of light and step into the shadows. Though the earth wished to keep her, it understood that this was the way of all things, the eternal dance between life and death, light and dark, spring and winter. And so, with a heavy heart, it allowed the forces to move as they must. Demeter, too, could feel the change. It was subtle at first, a shifting in the air, a quiet whisper in the wind. The flowers that once bloomed in abundance seemed to lose their vibrancy, their colors fading, their petals wilting in the sunlight. The earth's laughter, once so full of life, seemed to quiet as though it, too, was holding its breath. And in her heart, Demeter knew that her daughter's life was about to change in ways she could not prevent. Despite this deep, instinctual knowing, Demeter did not understand the full extent of what was coming. She did not yet know that Persephone would be drawn into the depths of the earth, to the shadowy realm of Hades, where the light of the sun would never touch her. She did not know that the earth itself would weep for the loss of her presence, for Persephone was the embodiment of spring's warmth and light. The earth would be left cold and barren in her absence, and Demeter's heart would break with grief. But for now, the sun still shone brightly, the fields were still rich with flowers, and Persephone's laughter still filled the air. The earth, though it could sense the coming change, allowed the moment to remain, as if holding on to the last remnants of peace before the inevitable shift. Demeter cherished these moments with her daughter, holding them close to her heart, for she knew that they would soon become memories. Memories of a time when Persephone walked among the flowers, when the earth was alive with warmth and light. And in the deep shadows, Hades waited. It was a day like any other, at least in the beginning. The sun hung high in the sky, casting its warm golden light across the fields where Persephone wandered. The flowers, as they had for countless days before, bloomed beneath her feet, their delicate petals swaying in the soft breeze. The world was full of life, and Persephone moved through it as though it belonged entirely to her, the embodiment of spring's endless promise. But the air, that day, felt heavier than usual, as if the very earth had taken a breath and held it, waiting. There was a strange stillness, a silence that had crept unnoticed into the atmosphere. The birds, who had once filled the air with their cheerful songs, seemed to pause in their flight, and even the wind seemed to hold back its usual rustle through the leaves. Persephone, blissfully unaware of the subtle change around her, continued her path through the fields, weaving through the vibrant blooms with an innocent joy. It was then that the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, a faint, unnoticed shift, like the deep sigh of the earth itself. Before she could fully comprehend the change, a shadow fell across her, swift and sudden, cutting through the light. A chasm of darkness seemed to open beneath the bright sky, as if the sun's rays had been swallowed whole by a great unseen force. And then, without warning, the earth parted. The ground cracked open, and from the depths of the world, a figure emerged, dark and silent, a god whose very presence seemed to swallow the light around him. It was Hades, the lord of the underworld, his dark cloak billowing behind him as he rose from the earth's chasm. His eyes, cold and unyielding, were fixed on Persephone. The world around her seemed to darken, as though time itself had slowed. The flowers she had so joyfully danced among now seemed distant, their colours muted in the strange gloom that had descended. The breeze that had once carried the sweet fragrance of the earth now carried the scent of something darker, a sharp, unsettling cold. The joy that had filled the fields just moments before was now replaced by an overwhelming sense of foreboding. Persephone stood, frozen in place, as Hades extended his hand toward her. There was no sound, no cry of warning, only the quiet, inevitable pull of fate. His presence was commanding, yet unspoken, and Persephone, caught in the moment, found herself unable to move. In the space between breaths, the earth seemed to hold its own, and for a heartbeat there was no time, only this singular dark moment. Then, as if driven by some unknown force, Hades seized Persephone in his grasp, lifting her from the earth and pulling her into the chasm that had opened beneath them. She gasped, her heart racing, as the familiar world above vanished into the depths. The fields, the flowers, the sun. All of it was swallowed by the gaping hole, as though it had never existed. And Persephone, now in the grip of the Lord of the Underworld, was carried away, her once bright world fading into darkness. The descent was swift and without mercy. The earth closed behind them, and the world above became nothing more than a distant memory. In the quiet darkness, Persephone's mind raced, but the overwhelming force of the situation left her with little more than a deep, instinctual fear. She did not know where she was going, only that she was being pulled away from everything she had known. The journey to the underworld was unlike anything Persephone had ever imagined. The light of the sun, the warmth of the earth, the fragrances of the flowers, all of it disappeared, replaced by the cold, unyielding grasp of the underworld. The air was thick with the scent of the earth's deepest shadows, and the very ground beneath her felt foreign, cold, and unwelcoming. As they descended, Persephone could feel the pull of an unfamiliar weight, the weight of the underworld itself pressing down on her. It was as if the very air here was heavy, suffocating, and it seemed to draw the breath from her lungs. The world of light, of warmth and spring was now a distant memory, a faraway land that seemed as unreachable as the stars. Hades, his grip firm and unrelenting, said nothing as he took Persephone deeper into the shadows. The further they went, the darker it became, until there was nothing but the oppressive stillness of the underworld. The distant echoes of lost souls seemed to whisper in the darkness, their voices faint and mournful. But there was no comfort in these whispers, only a deep, abiding loneliness that filled the vast, empty space. Persephone, her heart pounding in her chest, struggled against the force that held her. But there was no escape. Hades was too powerful, the underworld too vast. It was a place where the sun's light could never reach, a realm where the warmth of spring could never touch the cold, lifeless earth. And in that moment, Persephone understood. She had been taken from the world she knew, from the joy of the flowers and the companionship of the nymphs, into a world of shadows, where the seasons no longer changed and the light was forever absent. The weight of that realization settled on her heart like a stone, heavy and unrelenting. She had been taken, not by her will, but by the will of another, and she was now a captive of the underworld, a place where time stood still, where the earth's endless cycles were forgotten, and where the light of the sun would never again touch her. The underworld, vast and shadowed, swallowed Persephone whole, pulling her farther away from the world she had known. The darkness was impenetrable, wrapping around her like a heavy cloak, cold and suffocating. Every movement seemed to drag her deeper into a realm untouched by the warmth of the sun. There were no flowers here, no gentle breezes, no birdsong. There was only silence, a deep, oppressive quiet, broken only by the distant murmurs of spirits long lost. Persephone struggled, her breath shallow as she tried to pull away, but Hades' grip was unyielding. He did not speak, his face as impassive as stone, his eyes fixed ahead as they travelled further into the depths of his domain. There was no comfort in his touch, no warmth in his presence. He was a god of the dead, the ruler of this shadowy realm, and his power here was absolute. Persephone, though a goddess herself, was small in comparison to the vastness of the underworld and its ruler. As they journeyed deeper into the heart of the underworld, Persephone's mind raced. She had always known that the world held mysteries, forces beyond mortal understanding, but she had never imagined that the very earth she loved could hold such dark and silent places. Her thoughts turned to her mother, Demeter, and the fields she had left behind. Would her mother come for her? Would the earth wither without her presence? These questions swirled in Persephone's mind, but there was no answer, only the cold, unfeeling silence of the underworld. The path they followed was long and winding, the air growing colder with every step. Persephone's feet, once light and free in the fields of spring, now felt heavy, burdened by the weight of the darkness around her. She could not escape. The pull of the underworld was too strong, and Hades's power too great. There was no turning back. As they finally reached the throne room of the underworld, Persephone was struck by the stark contrast between the world she had left behind and the cold, dark beauty of her new surroundings. The throne room was a place of deathly majesty, its walls carved from the deepest stone, its floors black as coal. There was no warmth here, no light. The only source of illumination came from the faint, eerie glow of the river Styx, its waters dark and unmoving, flowing silently through the realm of the dead. Hades, still silent, released Persephone's arm, but his presence remained like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. He motioned for her to sit on the throne beside him, the seat cold and unforgiving. Persephone hesitated, her body trembling from both fear and the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. She was no longer a carefree child of spring, no longer the goddess of blooming flowers and gentle breezes. Here she was a captive, bound to a realm where light never touched and warmth never came. "Why have you brought me here?" Persephone finally found her voice, though it was weak and filled with uncertainty. "I belong to the earth, to my mother. Please, release me." But Hades said nothing. His gaze, cold and distant, remained fixed on her. It was not a gaze of malice, but of quiet resolve. He had claimed her, and in the silent power of his gaze, he showed no sign of remorse, no flicker of doubt. To him, Persephone was not a captive in the traditional sense. She was his queen, his equal, the one who would share in his rule over the underworld. Persephone's heart ached with a grief so deep it seemed to drown out all other thoughts. Her world had been ripped away from her in an instant, leaving her with nothing but the unyielding cold and darkness of the underworld. Her mind turned to her mother, Demeter, and the bond they had shared. How would Demeter bear the loss of her only daughter? How could the earth continue without Persephone's presence to guide the cycles of life and death? As Persephone sat there beside Hades on the throne of shadows, she felt the weight of her destiny settle upon her. This was no ordinary moment. This was the beginning of a new existence, one that would forever separate her from the world above. And yet, there was a part of her, buried deep within, that understood, even in her sorrow, that she had a role to play here in the underworld. There was a deeper, unspoken understanding between her and Hades, one that transcended the immediate pain of separation. In the stillness of the throne room, Persephone finally understood the magnitude of her journey. She was not simply a captive, not merely a victim of fate. She was, in a way, destined for this realm, for this marriage between light and shadow, life and death. And though the cold of the underworld pierced her heart, there was also a deep, quiet power in the knowledge that she had been chosen to share in this realm's dominion. But that knowledge did little to quell the ache in her chest, the longing for the world she had left behind. For now, her life in the world of light was gone, and she was bound to a kingdom where darkness reigned, where the earth's cycles were no longer defined by the warmth of the sun, but by the eternal reign of death. Above, in the world of light, Demeter, goddess of the harvest, was lost in a deep sorrow that spread across the earth like a shadow. The fields, once abundant and ripe with the promise of life, had begun to wither. The crops, untouched by the hand of mortals, drooped and died in the absence of Persephone's radiant presence. The sun shone, but its warmth could no longer reach the earth in the same way. The seasons were out of balance, and the land, though still rich with life, seemed to feel the emptiness left by the loss of its daughter. Demeter had long been protective of Persephone, keeping her close in the tender embrace of her love. Yet now her beloved daughter was gone, taken from her by a force far stronger than the love of a mother. In the quiet solitude of her grief, Demeter wandered the earth, seeking, searching, hoping against hope that she would find some sign of Persephone's presence. But there was nothing. The land seemed barren without her, and Demeter's heart broke with every step. The goddess of the harvest had always been one with the earth, and she had nurtured the crops and plants as though they were her own children. The fields had flourished under her touch, and life had been bountiful. But now, as the seasons turned and Persephone's absence deepened, Demeter's power began to fade. The flowers no longer bloomed, and the fruit trees stood empty, their branches bare. It was as if the very earth itself was mourning the loss of the young goddess. In her grief, Demeter withdrew from the world. She abandoned her duties as the goddess of the harvest, and the earth reflected her sorrow. The winds grew colder, the rains ceased, and the earth became barren. Where once there had been the promise of new life, there was now only an unyielding stillness. Crops failed, the land turned grey, and the people of the earth began to suffer. Without Demeter's care, the earth could no longer nourish them, and the world seemed to fall into an endless winter. It was in this time of desolation that the gods above began to notice the change. The Olympians, who had always relied on Demeter's care to sustain the mortal world, felt the effects of her absence. The food of the earth had dwindled, and the people below cried out in desperation. Zeus, the king of the gods, who had once watched over the balance of all things, now saw that his own domain was in danger. Without Demeter's blessing, the harvest would not grow, and the balance of the world would be lost. In his wisdom, Zeus knew that he must act. He called upon his messengers, the gods, to search for Persephone and bring her back to the light. Hermes, the swift-footed messenger, was sent to the underworld to seek out the truth of Persephone's fate. Yet, even Hermes, with all his speed and cunning, could not reach the depths of Hades' domain without first confronting the power of the god of the dead. And so, the search for Persephone began, though it would not be swift. Meanwhile, Demeter's grief deepened. She wandered the earth in search of her daughter, but her eyes could not find what her heart longed for. She visited the sacred groves, the great temples, and the fertile fields, calling out for Persephone, but there was only silence in return. The earth, once alive with the hum of life, now seemed empty and hollow. Demeter's sorrow was so great that even the flowers, which once bloomed in abundance, refused to grow. The people of the earth, too, began to feel the weight of the goddess's grief. The harvests failed, and hunger began to spread across the land. Crops that had once grown tall and strong with Demeter's touch now withered in the fields. The mortals, who had always depended on her for sustenance, cried out to the gods, but there was no answer. Demeter's grief had become a shadow over the world, and the earth itself seemed to mourn with her. In this time of despair, Demeter withdrew into a cave, far from the realms of gods and mortals alike. There, alone in her sorrow, she wept for her lost daughter, her tears falling like rain upon the barren earth. The seasons, once governed by her care, had come to a standstill. Spring, summer, and autumn had passed without their usual rhythms. The land, frozen in a deep winter, could not find its way back to life without Persephone's return. Yet, in the depths of her sorrow, Demeter could still feel the pull of her daughter's presence. She knew, deep down, that Persephone was not lost forever, that she was somewhere in the world, somewhere where Demeter could not reach her. The love between mother and daughter was an unbreakable bond, and even in her grief, Demeter could sense Persephone's soul. But that connection, as strong as it was, could not stop the devastation that spread across the earth. It was as if the world itself held its breath, waiting for the moment when Demeter's sorrow would finally lift and life could begin again. But Demeter could not yet see the way forward. She was too lost in her grief, too consumed by the emptiness that had overtaken her world. The world above was in mourning. The earth, which had once flourished under the watchful care of Demeter, now lay barren, its fields empty and its harvests failed. The sun, though still in the sky, offered no warmth, and the once fertile land could not sustain the people who depended on it. The gods themselves felt the weight of Demeter's grief, for her sorrow was not only her own, it had touched the very heart of the world, casting a shadow over both mortals and immortals alike. Zeus, seeing the devastation that had befallen the earth, knew that something had to be done. Demeter's sorrow had become too great, and the world could not continue without her. The mortal realm was on the verge of collapse, and the gods' powers alone could not restore balance. The loss of Persephone was the key, and the solution lay in bringing her back to the earth. So, with a heavy heart, Zeus called upon Hermes, the messenger of the gods, to descend into the underworld and find Persephone. Hermes, swift and resourceful, was well suited to the task. His task was not only to find Persephone, but to negotiate with Hades, whose realm was one of darkness and death, to persuade him to release the young goddess. The journey to the underworld was long and perilous, even for Hermes, who was known for his speed and cunning. The realm of the dead was not easily traversed, and the path to it was fraught with danger. But Hermes, with his divine abilities, moved swiftly, his wings carrying him above the earth and into the shadowed realm beneath. As he entered the underworld, he was greeted by its stillness, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow sound itself. In the heart of the underworld, Hermes found Hades seated upon his dark throne, his cold eyes fixed on the messenger. The god of the dead did not rise to greet him, nor did he speak, but the weight of his presence was undeniable. Hermes, with all his charm and grace, bowed respectfully before the lord of the underworld. "Hades," Hermes began, his voice measured yet firm. "The earth weeps for the loss of Persephone. Her absence has thrown the world into turmoil. Demeter, her mother, has withdrawn from her duties, and the mortal realm suffers in her grief. The seasons are out of balance and the harvests have failed. We ask that you release Persephone so that life may return to the earth." Hades did not immediately respond. His gaze was steady, unyielding, and his silence stretched between them like a heavy fog. But eventually he spoke, his voice deep and commanding. "I understand your plea, Hermes," Hades said, his tone calm, though it held the weight of finality. "But Persephone is here with me now. She is my queen, and in my realm she shall reign alongside me. The underworld is her home as much as it is mine." Hermes, ever quick to find a solution, knew that he had to approach this matter delicately. He had not come to simply ask for Persephone's return. He had come to bargain, to find a way to make the exchange possible. And so, he continued, speaking softly but with purpose. "Hades, I do not dispute that Persephone is your queen," Hermes said. "But surely you understand the necessity of the earth's cycles. Demeter, her mother, cannot live without her daughter. The mortal world will continue to wither and die without the light that Persephone brings. I ask only that you allow her to return to the surface for part of the year, that she might restore balance to the earth." There was a long pause as Hades considered Hermes's words. The god of the underworld had always been a figure of great power, but his realm was one of death and stillness. He had taken Persephone not out of malice, but because he had seen in her something that no other could offer: a companion, a queen who would rule beside him in the eternal darkness. But even Hades, though powerful, was not blind to the earth's suffering. "I understand the importance of balance, Hermes," Hades finally said, his voice measured. "But Persephone is mine, and I will not simply let her go. However, I am willing to make a bargain." Hermes listened closely, knowing that any agreement with Hades would have lasting consequences. The lord of the underworld was known for his cleverness and his ability to make deals that would not easily be undone. But Hermes was no stranger to bargaining with gods, and he knew that the key to restoring balance lay in a fair and just arrangement. "What sort of bargain do you propose?" Hermes asked. Hades leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the quiet wisdom of one who had lived through countless ages. "I will allow Persephone to return to the earth for part of the year," he said. "But she must return to the underworld when the cold months begin, when the harvest has been gathered and the earth begins its slumber. In exchange for this, I will release her for 6 months of the year, the time when the earth blooms and life flourishes." Hermes considered this offer carefully. It was a fair compromise, one that allowed for Persephone's return to the earth, while also recognizing Hades's right to his queen. After all, the underworld was her home as much as the surface world, and balance could only be restored by honoring both realms. "I accept your terms, Hades," Hermes said, bowing respectfully. With the agreement made, Hermes left the underworld, his wings carrying him back to the surface. The deal had been struck, and Persephone would be allowed to return to the earth for half the year. The world would once again see the light of spring, the warmth of summer, and the bounty of autumn. But when the time came for the earth to sleep, Persephone would return to the darkness, to the cold embrace of the underworld. With the agreement between Hermes and Hades settled, the journey back to the earth began. Yet, even as Hermes ascended from the depths of the underworld, the world above remained in mourning. The land, deprived of its goddess, had withered. The flowers no longer bloomed. The trees were barren, and the once vibrant earth now felt cold and distant. Demeter's grief had left the earth in a state of deep sorrow, its beauty fading with each passing day. The sun, though it rose in the sky, no longer held the warmth it once did, and the wind carried no scent of spring. For Demeter, the loss of Persephone was more than just the absence of her daughter. It was the absence of all that the earth had once symbolized: growth, life, and the eternal cycles that bound the world together. Without Persephone's presence, there was no light, no vitality, and the seasons seemed to stand still. In her sorrow, Demeter had withdrawn, refusing to allow the earth to renew itself. It was a time of stasis, of endless winter. Even the most hopeful hearts in the mortal realm felt the weight of the cold. And yet, deep within the underworld, Persephone felt the pull of the earth calling to her. The agreement that had been struck between Hermes and Hades had given her hope, but it had not quelled the ache in her heart. She longed to return to the land she had once walked, to feel the warmth of the sun upon her face, to hear the songs of birds and the rustle of the leaves. But the shadows of the underworld held her still, and Hades, though he had agreed to release her, kept a silent watch over his queen. When Persephone finally emerged from the dark realm, it was not as the child who had once danced freely in the meadows. She was no longer the carefree goddess of spring. She had been marked by the underworld, her time spent in the depths of shadow. Though she was free to return to the surface, something inside her had changed. A quiet, unspoken understanding of the balance between life and death, light and dark. Her heart, though still filled with love for the earth, now carried the weight of the underworld's stillness. The world above would never again feel the same. When Persephone returned, the earth began to stir. Slowly but surely, the land felt the warmth of her presence. The flowers that had once withered began to bloom once more. The trees, barren and empty, grew heavy with fruit, and the fields that had been cold and lifeless began to turn green again. The wind, once stilled by sorrow, picked up, carrying the sweet fragrance of the earth as it had before. But as the earth began to breathe again, Demeter's sorrow did not immediately lift. The goddess of the harvest had endured so much pain, and though Persephone's return gave her hope, the grief of her long absence still lingered. She moved slowly through the fields, feeling the soil beneath her feet, but the shadow of loss still hung over her. The joy she had once found in the earth's cycles was now tempered by the memory of the time when her daughter had been taken from her. The earth, too, seemed to feel the weight of this loss, for it had witnessed the turning of the seasons without Persephone. It had felt the cold of winter stretch longer than it should, and the absence of the goddess had left its mark. As Demeter wandered the land, tending to the crops that had begun to bloom again, the earth seemed to mourn with her. The flowers, once so vibrant, now seemed to grow more slowly, as if reluctant to return to their former glory. The breeze, which had once carried the sounds of birds and life, now whispered with a quiet sadness, as though it, too, had felt the darkness that had come. Demeter's love for Persephone was so great that it seemed to radiate from her, filling the air with a sense of longing and hope. But it was also tempered by the grief she carried. The reunion was bittersweet, for while Persephone had returned, the shadow of the underworld still clung to her, and Demeter's heart still bore the scars of her daughter's absence. As much as Demeter rejoiced in the return of the life she had once known, she could not forget the days when the world had been without its warmth. Persephone, too, felt the weight of the earth's mourning. The flowers that bloomed in her presence seemed to carry a softness, as if they were delicate, fragile, unsure of their own return. The leaves rustled, but they did so with a quiet sadness, as if acknowledging the pain that had passed through the earth. The joy of spring was not as it once had been. It was a new kind of joy, one that had been tempered by the knowledge of darkness, of death, of the underworld. And yet Persephone had returned. The earth began to turn once more, and the seasons, though they carried the weight of sorrow, began their slow and steady march forward. Demeter's heart, though still heavy, found a sense of peace in knowing that her daughter was with her again. The flowers bloomed, the trees bore fruit, and the fields once again yielded their bounty. But there was something different in the air, a quiet, reflective calm that had not been there before. In the silence of the land, the earth seemed to speak in a language only those who truly understood its rhythms could hear. It was the language of loss and renewal, of the delicate balance between light and dark, life and death. And though the sorrow would never fully fade, the earth found a way to continue, to move forward, to begin again. Persephone's return had brought the seasons back, but they were forever changed, just as she was. As Persephone's footsteps touched the earth once again, the world seemed to take a deep breath, as though it had been holding itself in suspense. The land had been cold and barren in her absence, but now, with her return, the earth began to stir with life once more. The warmth of the sun, once faint and distant, now seemed to return in full force, reaching across the fields and into the groves where the flowers had begun to grow again. The air was thick with the sweet fragrance of blossoms, their vibrant colours filling the once dreary world. Persephone, though marked by the darkness of her time in the underworld, felt the earth's call as it pulsed beneath her feet. The vibrant green of the grass seemed to welcome her back. The sound of the birds in the trees filled the air once more, and the gentle rustling of the leaves whispered a song of renewal. In the distance, the trees that had once been barren now grew heavy with fruit, and the rivers that had slowed in Demeter's sorrow now moved with a renewed vigour. Spring had returned, but it was not the same spring that had once greeted Persephone when she first played in the meadows. This was a spring tempered with wisdom, with the quiet knowledge of both light and shadow. Persephone walked with a sense of peace and grace, aware of the balance she now held within herself. She was no longer the carefree child of spring. She had experienced the depth of the underworld, felt the cold grip of death, and understood the cycle of life and rebirth in ways she never had before. As the earth blossomed around her, Persephone knew that her time in the world of light was precious. She had seen the deep silence of the underworld, and it had left its mark on her. The warmth of the sun, the softness of the flowers, the song of the wind, all of it was now more meaningful, more poignant than ever before. She had lived between two realms, and in doing so, she had come to understand the true nature of both life and death. Demeter, too, felt the earth's renewal, but her heart was still heavy. The grief that had once consumed her had lessened with the return of her daughter, but it was not completely gone. She could still remember the cold, desolate days when Persephone had been taken from her, and though she rejoiced in her daughter's return, there was a quiet part of her that would always carry the shadow of that loss. The seasons, once so simple in their rhythms, had become more complex in her mind. The joy of spring was no longer pure and untainted. It had become a reminder of the balance between life and death, between the light of day and the shadow of night. As Persephone walked beside her mother, the two of them together in the fields, there was a silent understanding between them. Demeter had felt the weight of the earth's sorrow, but now, in Persephone's return, she felt the warmth of life once more. The earth began to respond to Demeter's touch again. Flowers bloomed in great clusters, the grass grew tall and lush, and the fruits of the earth ripened on the branches. For now, the land was alive with the power of spring. Yet, Demeter knew that the balance of the seasons could not be undone. Persephone's return was a fleeting one, a gift for the earth that would only last for half the year. As the warmth of the spring sun embraced them both, Demeter could not shake the knowledge that, in time, Persephone would again be drawn into the underworld, called back to the darkness when the cold winds began to blow. For Persephone, the return of spring was bitter-sweet. Though she loved the earth, the warmth of her mother's embrace, and the freedom of the light, she carried the knowledge of the underworld within her. Her time in the realm of shadows had changed her, and the earth she had returned to now seemed different, more fragile, more precious. Every flower, every tree, every passing breeze was a reminder of what had been, and what would one day return to shadow. Still, she embraced the beauty of the spring, knowing that this season, like all things, was fleeting. The earth would once again fall into slumber as she returned to Hades, and the cycle would continue as it always had. The flowers would bloom, the fruits would ripen, and then, in the quiet of autumn, Persephone would be taken back into the underworld, where the world would again fall silent, waiting for her return. But for now, Persephone walked in the sunlight, her heart filled with both peace and sorrow. The earth had come alive again, and with it she had found a sense of balance between light and dark, life and death. She had lived in the shadows, and now she walked in the light once more. And in this cycle, in this eternal dance, there was a quiet beauty. For though the seasons change, and though life and death are bound in an endless circle, there is always the promise of return, of renewal, of spring. As the seasons slowly changed, the earth beneath Persephone's feet seemed to take on a deeper meaning. Though she was once a child of the sun, dancing freely among the flowers, she now walked with a quiet understanding of the balance that governed all things. Her time in the underworld had taught her the delicate harmony between life and death, light and shadow, and spring and winter. Her very being had become a symbol of this eternal dance, one that flowed in cycles, moving seamlessly between joy and sorrow, warmth and cold. Every day that Persephone spent on the earth felt more precious than the last. She could sense the weight of time pressing gently upon her, the fleeting nature of her stay in the world above. The land flourished in her presence, as though it too understood the transitory nature of spring. The flowers bloomed more vibrantly in the days that she walked among them, their petals soft with colour and life. The trees, heavy with fruit, seemed to bow their branches in her honour, their leaves rustling in the breeze with a gentle sigh of relief. But Persephone was no longer the carefree goddess of childhood who had once revelled in the sunlit fields. Her time in the underworld had changed her. There was an inner stillness in her now, a quiet grace that came from the understanding of the eternal cycle. She knew that her return to the earth was a temporary one. In time, the warmth of the sun would fade, and the cold winds of winter would call her back to the shadowy realm she had once feared. Yet, she also knew that her return to the darkness was not an end, but a part of the greater rhythm, a rhythm that brought both life and death into balance. Demeter, too, began to understand this balance. While her heart still longed for the days when Persephone was with her all year, she could not deny the wisdom in the cycle that now defined her daughter's life. Though it pained her to see Persephone leave, Demeter knew that the earth needed this rhythm, the changing of the seasons, the ebb and flow of life, the birth of spring, and the quiet slumber of winter. The seasons would always turn, and in the turning there was both peace and renewal. Together, Demeter and Persephone walked through the fields, their bond strengthened by the knowledge that their time together, though brief, was sacred. They would part again when the time came, but for now they shared in the beauty of the world around them. Persephone had come to appreciate the quiet beauty of the earth in a way she never had before. She knew that she was a part of this great cycle, a force that both nurtured and was nurtured by the earth's rhythms. In the days that followed, Persephone often found herself standing at the edge of a field, watching the horizon where the sky met the earth. She felt a quiet peace in knowing that the land would continue to flourish in her absence, and that her time in the underworld would not be one of loss, but of transformation. There was an understanding in her heart now, a recognition that life and death were not opposing forces, but two halves of the same whole. She would return to the underworld, and in doing so, she would help to maintain the balance that governed both realms. The earth, in its quiet wisdom, seemed to acknowledge this balance. The flowers bloomed, the trees grew tall and strong, and the harvests flourished under the watchful eyes of Demeter and Persephone. But even as the earth thrived, Persephone could sense that her time above was slipping away. The days grew shorter, the air cooler, and the golden light of autumn began to touch the fields. Soon, the land would fall into slumber, and Persephone would return to the underworld, where she would rule beside Hades until the springtime brought her back to the world of the living. Though it was a difficult truth to accept, Persephone had come to see her time in the underworld not as a captivity, but as a necessary part of the cycle. She was both a daughter of the earth and a queen of the underworld, and in her dual existence she was a bridge between the living and the dead, between light and dark. Her return to the underworld was not a retreat, but a continuation of the eternal balance. As the leaves began to change color and the first chill of winter crept into the air, Persephone knew that her time on the earth was drawing to a close. She had seen the earth come alive again in her presence, and she had been a part of the cycles that governed it. But now, the seasons would turn once more, and she would be called back to the depths where the quiet shadows of the underworld awaited her return. Though Demeter's heart would once again ache with the absence of her daughter, she had come to understand the deeper meaning of Persephone's journey. They were not two separate beings, but two halves of a whole, two forces that together brought balance to the world. Persephone's return to the underworld would bring the earth's rest, its quiet slumber, but it would also bring the promise of spring. And when Persephone would return again, so too would the earth awaken. The balance between light and dark, life and death would continue. The earth would sleep, and then, when the time was right, it would once again awaken with the beauty of Persephone's return. As the earth prepared for the quiet rest of winter, a deep, familiar tug began to pull at Persephone's heart. The warmth of the sun, so precious in her time above, began to fade. The soft, golden light of autumn dimmed, and the cool winds of the coming winter whispered to her, calling her back. Her time on the earth, though filled with life and renewal, was coming to an end, and the rhythm of the seasons could not be ignored. In the quiet moments before her departure, Persephone stood at the edge of the field, her gaze drawn to the horizon where the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a soft, amber glow across the land. She could feel the pull of the underworld calling her back, the place where shadows stretched long and time moved with a different kind of stillness. The knowledge of her return weighed heavily on her heart, but there was also a quiet understanding, a recognition that the dance between light and dark must continue. Demeter, ever aware of the changing seasons, also sensed the approaching shift. She had known this day would come, though her heart always ached at the thought of her daughter's departure. As Persephone walked beside her, Demeter spoke softly, the words laden with both love and sorrow. "Time moves quickly, my daughter," Demeter said, her voice a gentle murmur carried by the breeze. "The earth will sleep while you are gone, and I will carry the weight of your absence in my heart, but know that the earth will wait for you, just as it always has." Persephone nodded, her eyes reflecting the weight of her mother's words. She had come to understand the delicate balance that bound them both. The seasons, the land, the endless cycle of life and death. It was not a matter of separation, but of waiting. They would be apart, but never truly far from each other. The earth would rest, and in time, spring would return. With one final glance at the land she had walked for the past months, Persephone turned toward the place where the veil between the worlds was thinnest, where the underworld's dark embrace awaited her. The path she would take was well known, yet each descent into the shadowed realm felt like a journey into the unknown. Even though she had spent time there before, the underworld was a place of solitude, coldness, and stillness. There, among the souls of the departed, Persephone would be the queen, but it was a title born in silence and solitude. The descent was gradual, the earth giving way to darker realms, the colors of the world above fading as she ventured deeper. The sounds of the earth, the rustle of leaves and the songs of birds grew distant, replaced by the stillness of the underworld. The path was quiet, almost reverent, as if the very nature of this realm demanded a sacred silence. Persephone's steps, though slow and reluctant, echoed in the depths as she descended toward her home in the shadow. The closer she came to the underworld's gates, the colder the air became. The soft light of the earth's surface faded into an oppressive darkness, and Persephone felt the weight of it settle on her heart. It was not the fear of the underworld that troubled her, but the knowledge that she was leaving behind the warmth of the earth, the light of the sun, the vitality of the living. The underworld was a place of permanence, of endings, where time moved in long, unbroken stretches. It was a place where the earth's cycles ceased, where life, as she had known it, was still. As Persephone reached the gates of the underworld, the dark, silent figure of Hades stood waiting for her, his presence as imposing and cold as the realm he ruled. He did not speak, but his gaze held the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The lord of the underworld had accepted Persephone as his queen, and in that acceptance he had offered her a position beside him in the silence of death. She stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the realm of shadows, and the gates closed behind her with a quiet finality. The earth above, the sun, the flowers, the warmth of the world, all of it was now far behind her. She was once again a queen of the underworld, a ruler of the dead, where there was no warmth, no growth, only the stillness of eternity. Hades led her deeper into the shadowed halls, his presence a silent guide as they moved through the underworld. The air was thick with the scent of ancient stone and the distant echoes of the souls that wandered this place. Persephone, though a goddess of spring, had come to understand that even in the absence of life, there was power in the underworld. It was not a place of desolation, but a place of transformation. Death was not an end, but a part of the cycle, a necessary counterpart to life. As she moved deeper into the underworld, Persephone felt the coolness of the air seep into her being, the silence of the realm filling the spaces within her. She was both a part of this place and apart from it. She had returned to the realm of shadows, but her time on the earth would always be with her. The seasons would continue to turn, and when the earth called her back, she would rise again, bringing life with her. But for now, the underworld was her home, where she would reign beside Hades in the quiet eternity of the dark. The earth had once again fallen silent. The warmth of Persephone's presence had faded, leaving behind an emptiness that stretched across the land like a cold shadow. Demeter, goddess of the harvest, felt the deep ache in her heart grow heavier with each passing day. As the autumn leaves fell from the trees and the last of the summer's warmth slipped away, the earth seemed to weep alongside her. Her daughter, whom she had nurtured, protected, and loved, had once more descended into the underworld, leaving the world of the living cold and barren. For Demeter, the seasons had always been a dance of life and death, light and dark. But now, without Persephone beside her, the rhythm felt broken, uneven. The harvests, once so abundant, now lay scattered and wasted. The crops that had flourished in the warmth of spring and summer withered under the chill of winter's approach. Even the animals seemed to retreat into the quiet corners of the earth, waiting for the cold to pass. Demeter wandered the earth in mourning, her heart heavy with the sorrow of her daughter's departure. The land, which she had always nurtured with love, now seemed foreign and lifeless. She moved through the empty fields, touching the bare trees and the withered flowers, but there was no joy in her touch. There was no warmth in the earth beneath her feet. It was as if the very soil had absorbed her grief, and the world had turned inward, awaiting the return of its goddess of spring. Her cries were soft, echoing through the empty fields. She had once been the one to bring life to the earth, to stir the soil and bring forth abundance. But now the earth lay still, and Demeter's sorrow seemed to silence the very world around her. She called out for Persephone, her voice a soft whisper on the wind, but there was no answer. The seasons had turned, and it was time for Persephone to return to the underworld. In her grief, Demeter withdrew further from the world. She refused to tend the harvests, allowing them to rot in the fields. The mortals who relied on her blessings, began to suffer, their food stores dwindling, their crops failing. The people of the earth turned their eyes to the heavens, praying to the gods, but there was no relief. Without Demeter's care, the land grew cold, and the darkness seemed to stretch on forever. Even the gods of Olympus felt the effects of Demeter's mourning. Without her blessings, the earth could not yield its fruit. The mortals suffered in silence, their cries rising to the heavens. Zeus, the king of the gods, saw the devastation spreading across the world. He knew that Demeter's grief was the cause, but he also knew that the earth could not remain in such a state forever. The balance of the seasons was a natural force, and it must be restored. But how could he ease Demeter's sorrow? How could he return Persephone to her mother without disturbing the delicate balance between life and death? It was a dilemma that weighed heavily on his heart. He understood that Persephone's time in the underworld was necessary, but he also saw the suffering it caused in the world above. In this moment of silence and sorrow, Demeter's connection to the earth grew deeper. As her grief settled into the land, the earth itself began to mourn with her. The winds grew colder, and the rivers slowed in their course. The sun's rays dimmed, casting the world in a perpetual twilight. The birds ceased to sing, and the trees stood bare against the sky, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the heavens. Yet, even in her deepest sorrow, Demeter knew that the earth could not remain in this state forever. She had given birth to the seasons, and the seasons must turn. She could not stop the natural cycle, no matter how great her grief. But in that quiet moment of mourning, she also knew that Persephone would one day return. The cycle would begin again. The earth would awaken, and the warmth of spring would return with the arrival of her daughter. But for now, Demeter mourned, as all mothers do when their children are taken from them. She walked the earth alone, her heart heavy with the weight of loss, but her love for Persephone never wavered. The earth might sleep for a while, but it would always wait for her return. And when that time came, Demeter would once again tend to the harvests, and the world would once again know the warmth of spring. The earth, in its silence, waited. Time moved differently in the underworld, but on the surface it was the same eternal rhythm. The harvests failed, the crops rotted in the fields, and Demeter, though still the goddess of the harvest, could not summon the warmth of spring. The people of the earth suffered, their lives uncertain and bleak without the promise of the seasons. The gods above saw the devastation, but none could ease Demeter's grief. And so the cycle continued, unbroken as it always had. The earth slept, waiting for Persephone's return. Demeter, too, waited. She had always known that the time would come when her daughter would return to her, bringing the light of spring once more. But it was not just the land that awaited Persephone. It was the very fabric of life itself. The earth could not survive in endless winter, and the rhythm of the seasons would always turn, no matter how painful the waiting might be. In the underworld, Persephone, now a queen in her own right, sat beside Hades, ruling the souls of the dead. Though the shadowed realm was quiet, it was not without its own life. Persephone, as queen, held dominion over the souls of the departed. But even in this place of silence, she knew the importance of her time on the earth. In the underworld, there was no spring, no summer, no growth. There was only stillness and quiet, the eternal night where time stretched on without the promise of renewal. Yet in her heart, Persephone carried the knowledge that the balance between life and death, light and dark, could only be preserved through the endless cycle. Hades, the god of the underworld, understood this balance. He had long accepted the rhythm of the world above, knowing that it was a force beyond his control. Though he had claimed Persephone as his queen, there was an unspoken agreement between them. She would reign with him for part of the year, but when the time came, she would return to the earth. It was not a matter of power, but of respect for the cycle that governed all things. Persephone was as much a part of the earth as she was a part of the underworld, and her dual existence was necessary for the balance of both realms. And so, the endless cycle continued. The time came when Persephone, in her quiet wisdom, knew that the moment had arrived. The earth, cold and barren, awaited her return. The harvests, though silent, whispered to her from the depths of the underworld. The very fabric of life above and below seemed to pull her toward the surface once more. The cycle was complete, and it was time for Persephone to leave the darkness and bring life to the world once more. With a quiet grace, Persephone rose from her throne beside Hades. She turned her gaze to the land she knew she would return to the earth that had once again slipped into slumber. There was no fear in her heart, only the knowledge that her journey was a necessary part of the great wheel that turned the seasons, bringing both death and life in its wake. She was the bridge between these two worlds, and her return would mark the earth's awakening. As Persephone ascended from the underworld, the shadows seemed to part before her, allowing the first rays of sunlight to break through. The coldness of the underworld lifted, and the warmth of the earth called to her once more. Hades, though a god of shadows, understood that this was the natural order of things. He watched as Persephone made her way back to the surface, where Demeter would wait for her. It was a bitter-sweet moment, as the lord of the underworld knew that he would have to part with his queen, but he also knew that their time together was part of the eternal rhythm. As Persephone emerged from the underworld, the earth began to stir. The flowers, long dormant, began to bloom again, their colors vivid and bright. The trees, which had stood bare against the cold, now unfurled their leaves, reaching toward the sun. The rivers, once still, now flowed with renewed life. The world above seemed to awaken as if the very air itself had been given new life. Demeter, upon feeling the first stirrings of life in the earth, looked up to the sky. She knew that her daughter had returned. Her heart, heavy with sorrow and hope, swelled with love as Persephone appeared before her, bathed in the golden light of the returning spring. The bond between mother and daughter, tested by time and sorrow, was stronger than ever. The earth, now alive with the promise of spring, seemed to hum with joy at their reunion. In that moment, Demeter understood that the endless cycle was not something to be feared. It was a rhythm that could not be stopped, one that would continue for as long as the earth remained. The life of the earth and the rule of the underworld were two halves of the same whole, two forces that must always be in balance. Persephone would return to the underworld when the time came, and the earth would sleep. But for now, Persephone was home, and the earth had come alive once more. As the seasons turned, the world above and below continued their eternal dance. Persephone, the queen of both realms, walked between them, bringing life and death in turn. And with each cycle, the earth flourished and rested, as it always had and always would. With each passing season, Persephone grew in wisdom, her understanding of the world and its rhythms deepening with every cycle. Her time between the worlds, between the living and the dead, between the light of the earth and the shadow of the underworld, had shaped her into a being unlike any other. No longer the carefree goddess who once danced in the meadows, Persephone had become a ruler, a queen of both life and death, a bridge between the two realms. In her years spent in the underworld, Persephone had learned the quiet power of stillness. Death was not an end, but a part of the great circle of existence. She had seen the souls of the departed drifting in the shadows, but she had also seen the beauty of the peace they found in the stillness. The underworld, despite its coldness, held a strange kind of serenity, a place where time moved differently and the weight of life's struggles faded away. It was a place of transformation, not destruction, where souls were given a final rest before being reborn in the earth's cycles. When Persephone returned to the surface, she carried that wisdom with her. She understood now that the earth too must rest. Its cycles of birth, growth, and decay were as much a part of life as the eternal rhythms of the underworld. Life could not exist without death, and death could not exist without life. Both were necessary, not only for the world of gods, but for the mortals who walked upon the earth. As she walked once more through the blooming fields of spring, Persephone could feel the balance between the two worlds in a way that she never had before. Her dual existence was a reflection of the earth's own cycle, a continuous movement between life and death, between light and dark, between warmth and cold. In this balance, she found peace. She was no longer torn between her roles as the goddess of spring and queen of the underworld. They were not separate parts of her, but two sides of the same whole. In her wisdom, Persephone understood that her role was not to resist the natural order of things, but to embrace it. The earth would always need its cycles, the passage of the seasons would continue, and the dance between life and death would remain unbroken. Just as the earth could not exist without its seasons, Persephone could not exist without both worlds. The realm of the living and the realm of the dead. She shared this wisdom with Demeter, who too had grown in understanding. Demeter's grief for her daughter had not vanished, but it had softened over time. She had come to realize that her daughter's journey was a necessary part of the earth's cycle. When Persephone was in the underworld, the earth would rest, and when she returned, it would awaken. Together, mother and daughter had come to understand that they were not separate, but part of the same great wheel that turned the seasons. In the quiet moments when Persephone stood beside her mother, looking out over the fields, she knew that the earth would always wait for her. The earth would always be here, in its cycles of growth and decay, life and death. It was in these moments of stillness that Persephone felt the deep peace of the earth's rhythms, the quiet understanding that her journey between worlds was not something to fear, but something to embrace. She was both a part of the earth and apart from it, a being who could walk between the living and the dead, bringing with her the wisdom of both realms. The people of the earth too felt the effects of Persephone's wisdom. The crops flourished when she returned, and the earth seemed to bloom with an understanding that the seasons would always turn, that life would always come again, even after the darkest of winters. Mortals who knew the story of Persephone began to understand that their own lives too followed these cycles, of birth death, and rebirth. They looked to the seasons not with fear, but with hope, knowing that even in the darkest times, the light would return. Persephone, the goddess who had once walked the earth in innocence, now stood as a queen, ruling both the realm of the dead and the living. She had come to understand the delicate balance between the two worlds, and in doing so, she had become a symbol of that balance. She was the embodiment of the cycles of nature, the ruler of life and death, the goddess who brought both the dawn of spring and the quiet of winter. And so, with each passing season, Persephone continued her journey, knowing that her place in the world was one of great power and great responsibility. She had found peace in her dual existence, understanding that she was both a daughter of the earth and a queen of the underworld. In this knowledge, she found the wisdom to guide the world through its endless cycles, bringing light when needed and offering rest when the earth required it. The cycle of life and death, light and dark, would continue, as it always had, with Persephone at its heart. As the seasons continued to turn, Persephone's legacy grew. She was no longer just a goddess of the harvest, nor merely the queen of the underworld. Her role in the great cycles of life had become much more than a singular title. She was both a ruler of life and death, a deity who bridged the gap between the living world and the realm of shadows. Persephone had come to embody the eternal dance between light and dark, a dance that had existed since the beginning of time. Her influence stretched across the earth, though it was not always seen in the same way that the sun's rays or the growth of the harvest were. Her power was more subtle, more pervasive. It was woven into the fabric of nature itself, felt in the quiet moments when the earth rests, and in the energetic bursts of life that emerge from the soil. Persephone's journey between two realms had made her a symbol of transition, the passage between death and rebirth, the end of one phase and the beginning of another. In the hearts of mortals, Persephone's story was one of hope and understanding. They saw in her the reflection of their own lives, the inevitable cycles of birth, growth, decay, and renewal. When Persephone returned to the earth each spring, it was as though the world itself was being reborn. The flowers bloomed, the trees grew heavy with fruit, and the rivers swelled with new life. Her return brought with it a promise of hope, the understanding that even after the darkest days of winter, life would always return in some form. Her time in the underworld, though a place of darkness, was just as important. Mortals understood that death was not the end, but rather a part of the cycle that gave life its meaning. Persephone, as queen of the underworld, showed them that death was simply a passage, a rest before the rebirth of spring. Her role in the underworld was one of quiet strength and compassion. She ruled not with cruelty or fear, but with an understanding of the necessity of stillness, of peace. Persephone's legacy also lay in the way the earth responded to her presence. With each return, the earth came alive and the soil grew rich again. Her influence was not just felt in the vibrancy of the flowers or the bounty of the harvest, but in the very soul of the earth. Every new bloom, every growing tree, every fruit-bearing vine carried a part of Persephone with it. She had become an integral part of the earth's pulse, the force that moved the seasons, that shaped the world and its inhabitants. In time, the mortals began to celebrate Persephone's dual role in the earth's cycles. They honored her as both the goddess of spring and the queen of the underworld, understanding that both sides of her nature were necessary for the world to function. They offered prayers to her, asking for her blessings when they planted their seeds, for they knew that it was Persephone who could bring life to their crops. And when death came to their loved ones, they asked for her gentle hand to guide the souls of the departed into her realm. Persephone, in her wisdom, ruled both the living and the dead with the same grace, showing the world that death, too, had its place in the natural order. In the temples dedicated to her, mortals would come to offer their reverence, lighting candles in her name. The flame was a symbol of both life and death, a reflection of the seasons that would never cease. And through these offerings, they felt the balance between the two worlds, knowing that Persephone would always be there, waiting to guide the earth through its endless cycles. Her legacy was one of balance, the understanding that life could not exist without death, and death could not exist without life. The gods themselves came to understand and respect Persephone's role in the great order of the universe. Zeus, her father, though the king of the gods, recognized the necessity of her existence. Without her, the earth would be out of balance. Without her time in the underworld, the world above would grow weary, and the harvests would cease. He too saw that Persephone's reign over both the living and the dead was essential for the well-being of all. Even Hades, her husband and the lord of the underworld, had come to appreciate Persephone's role in the cosmic order. At first, he had claimed her as his queen, drawn to her beauty and strength. But over time, he understood that their union was not simply a matter of possession. It was a union between life and death, between the world above and the world below. Their partnership brought balance to the realms, and Hades had come to respect Persephone not just as his queen, but as the vital force that allowed both of their realms to thrive. As Persephone continued her journey through the seasons, her legacy became a living, breathing force in the world. The earth and its creatures, the gods and the mortals, all existed in harmony because of the balance she maintained. And even as she descended back into the underworld each year, her presence was never truly gone. The earth, though it rested, always awaited her return. The balance she had established between light and dark, life and death, remained unbroken, carried through the generations. Persephone's legacy was not only in the fertility of the earth or the guidance of the souls of the dead, but in the very understanding that life is cyclical, that each ending is simply a new beginning. She had become a symbol of transformation, not just for the world, but for all who understood the rhythm of the seasons. And as the earth continued to turn, her story would live on, an eternal reminder of the balance between the light and the dark, between life and death, that governs all things. As the years passed, Persephone's journey between the underworld and the earth became more than just a cycle of the seasons. It became an eternal dance, a dance between light and dark, life and death, joy and sorrow. This rhythm, ancient and unbroken, stretched beyond the boundaries of time, weaving the very fabric of existence itself. Persephone had come to embody the delicate balance that governed the universe. Her existence was a reminder that neither life nor death could exist without the other. The land above would thrive in the spring and summer, only to rest in the stillness of winter, waiting for her return. And in the underworld, where time moved slowly and the souls of the departed found their rest, There was the quiet understanding that the earth above would one day awaken again. Both realms were bound by the same rhythm, and Persephone was the key that kept them in harmony. In her dual role as the goddess of spring and the queen of the underworld, Persephone had become a living symbol of this eternal dance. Her time on the earth was brief, yet each return brought with it the renewal of life. The flowers bloomed, the trees sprouted new leaves, and the earth itself seemed to pulse with energy. But even as the world above came alive with color and vibrancy, Persephone knew that this too was fleeting. The days would grow shorter, the warmth of the sun would fade, and the earth would once again fall into the quiet embrace of winter. Yet, for Persephone, this cycle was not something to fear. It was something to embrace. Her time in the underworld had taught her that death was not an end, but a necessary part of life's ongoing rhythm. She had witnessed the transformation of the souls in the underworld, their passage from the world of the living to the world of the dead, and their eventual return to the earth in the form of new life. This was the true nature of existence, a continuous, unbroken cycle of death and rebirth. In the quiet moments when Persephone stood between the two realms, she felt the weight of this knowledge. She had lived through both life and death, and in doing so, she had come to understand that neither could exist without the other. Light could not shine without darkness, and life could not flourish without death's touch. The underworld, though silent and still, was as vital to the earth as the sunlight that warmed the flowers. And the earth, in all its vibrancy, was as necessary to the underworld as the quiet rest of winter. Persephone's understanding of this truth made her a powerful force, not in spite of her dual nature, but because of it. She had come to embody the balance that the world required, the understanding that everything in existence was part of an endless cycle. She had learned to navigate between the worlds with grace, accepting the inevitability of her journey and knowing that her role was essential to the world's continued harmony. Even Demeter, once consumed by grief and loss, had come to appreciate the rhythm of the seasons. Though the pain of her daughter's absence still lingered in her heart, Demeter had learned to embrace the cycles of life and death. She, too, understood that the earth must rest, just as it must thrive. Persephone's time in the underworld was a part of that rest, and Demeter had come to accept that this pause was necessary for the earth's renewal. The bond between mother and daughter had grown deeper with time, and their shared understanding of the world's cycles had brought them closer together. The mortals, too, began to understand the wisdom that Persephone had brought to the world. They saw the turning of the seasons as a reflection of their own lives, the moments of growth and abundance followed by periods of rest and quiet reflection. They understood that death was not something to fear, but a natural part of life's cycle. And as Persephone's story passed from one generation to the next, it became a symbol of the eternal dance between light and dark, life and death. In every blooming flower, in every growing tree, and in every fruit-bearing vine, the legacy of Persephone could be seen. Her influence stretched across the earth, a reminder of the fragile beauty of life and the quiet strength of death. She had come to represent the ever-turning wheel of the seasons, the endless cycle that would continue for as long as the earth endured. And so, the dance continued. The world turned, the seasons changed, and Persephone moved between the two realms, guiding the flow of life and death with the wisdom she had gained from both worlds. The balance she maintained would never falter, for it was the very foundation upon which all things rested. In the quiet moments when Persephone stood between the earth and the underworld, she could feel the pulse of the world, the rhythm of the eternal dance that had existed since the beginning of time. She was both a part of it and apart from it, a living reminder that all things are interconnected and that nothing in existence is truly separate. She was the link between the living and the dead, the light and the dark, the earth and the underworld. And in this role, she found peace, knowing that her journey was not one of separation, but of unification, the joining of two worlds bound by the endless cycle of life. And so, the wheel of time continued its unbroken spin, the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth, turning with its eternal rhythm. Persephone, the goddess who ruled both the light and the dark, remained at the heart of it, ever present in the delicate balance between the two worlds. She was not just the bringer of spring or the queen of the dead. She was the embodiment of the cycles themselves, the pulse of life, the quiet of death, the promise of return. Each time Persephone descended into the underworld, the earth would fall into its quiet rest. The flowers would sleep beneath the frozen earth, the trees would stand bare against the cold winds, and the world would feel the absence of her warmth. But even as the earth rested, there was always the certainty that Persephone would return. The darkness would never remain forever, just as the light would not stay always. The turning of the seasons, the endless ebb and flow of life and death, would continue as it had since the dawn of time. As Persephone moved between these two worlds, she had come to understand that her journey was not one of separation, but of unity. She was the bridge between realms, the link between the living and the dead. She had found peace in the quiet knowledge that her time in the underworld was as necessary as her time above the earth. Both were part of the same great rhythm, the same eternal dance that kept the world in balance. Her legacy was not just the seasons she governed, but the wisdom she had gained. Persephone knew that the light and dark, life and death, were not opposing forces, but two halves of the same whole. The world couldn't survive without both. Life, vibrant and full of energy, could not exist without the rest that death provided. And death, still and quiet, could not offer its peace without the return of life. It was a cycle that could not be broken, an eternal return that would never cease. As the years passed and the seasons turned, Persephone's story continued to echo in the hearts of those who looked to the earth and the heavens. The flowers bloomed, the trees grew, the harvests ripened, and the earth itself seemed to hum with life whenever Persephone returned. And when she descended once more to the underworld, the earth would rest, waiting for the next turn of the cycle. But the promise of spring, the return of Persephone, was always there, a constant reminder that after the darkest of times, light would always return. The mortals who lived their lives in the ever-changing seasons learned to embrace this truth. They understood that the cycles of nature mirrored their own lives. There were times of growth and abundance, times of rest and sorrow, and times of quiet reflection before the cycle began again. Persephone, the goddess who moved between the living world and the underworld, had become a symbol of this eternal truth, that everything has its time, and that time, though it may seem to stand still, is always moving, always turning, always bringing something new. And so, Persephone's return every spring was not just the awakening of the earth, but a reminder of the eternal dance that governed all things. It was a celebration of the cyclical nature of existence, a recognition that life is fleeting, but death and rebirth are inevitable, bound by forces beyond comprehension. In every blossom, in every blade of grass, in every breath of wind, the legacy of Persephone could be found. The goddess who ruled both life and death, and who had come to embody the very essence of the world's cycles. In the underworld, Persephone ruled with quiet strength, guiding the souls of the departed with grace, understanding that their time too was part of the great cycle. And as she ruled the earth, bringing forth life when the time was right, she never forgot the quiet wisdom of the underworld, the stillness that gave rise to the next season, the next cycle of life. Both realms were hers to guide, and through her, the eternal return continued, unbroken. In the stillness of the earth's winter, as the land lay dormant beneath the cold soil, Persephone knew that it was only temporary. The sun would return, the flowers would bloom, and the earth would once again awaken to the light. Life, death, and rebirth would continue, as it always had, for as long as the world spun. And thus, Persephone's story was not just one of light, nor just one of dark. It was the story of the eternal return, the never-ending rhythm that governed the world, that bound life and death in a sacred dance. A dance that would continue for all time, as long as the earth turned, the seasons changed, and Persephone moved between the worlds. As Persephone's presence graced the earth, the seasons began their gradual change. The vibrant heat of summer softened into the crisp, golden air of autumn. The flowers that had bloomed in spring now began to fade, their petals falling gently to the ground. The leaves, once bright and green, took on hues of amber, crimson, and gold, signaling the change that was inevitable, the closing of one cycle and the quiet approach of the next. Persephone's heart, ever bound to the earth, felt the soft shift in the air. Autumn, though not as full of life as spring, brought its own kind of beauty, one of quiet transition. The earth, still rich with the remnants of summer's bounty, began to prepare for the rest that winter would bring. Though Persephone knew that her time above was coming to an end, she could not help but feel the pull of the changing earth. The cool winds whispered through the trees, and the harvest began. Farmers and mortals alike worked tirelessly, gathering the fruits of their labor before the frost could claim them. The land was rich with the promise of abundance, but there was also a sense of quiet finality in the air, a reminder that all things must rest. For Persephone, autumn was a time of reflection. It was a moment to look back on the vibrancy of the spring and summer, and to prepare for the stillness of the underworld. She walked among the fields, feeling the weight of the earth beneath her feet, its rhythm softening as the world prepared to sleep. There was a beauty in this finality, in the way the earth gave itself over to the cold and quiet of winter, trusting that it would one day awaken. Though Persephone knew that soon the time would come for her to return to the underworld, she cherished these final days above the earth. Autumn, in all its quiet splendor, had a deep, quiet beauty that spoke to her soul. It was a reminder that life is always changing, moving from one stage to the next. There was no need to resist the fall of the leaves or the chill in the air. It was simply part of the cycle. The earth would rest, and with its rest, it would find renewal. For now, Persephone watched as the world around her seemed to embrace the shift, the transition, the letting go. There was something deeply peaceful about autumn's approach. The harvests would be brought in, and the earth would prepare for the cold. But Persephone knew that the quiet of winter would only last for so long. And when spring returned, it would return with the same promise of life, vitality, and abundance that had always been. As the earth cooled and autumn's chill deepened, Persephone felt the inevitable pull of the underworld. Her time on the surface was nearing its end, and the cycle, once again, was calling her back to the shadowed realm. The golden light of autumn faded behind her as she made her way toward the gates of the underworld, the weight of both her role and the earth's cycles settling in her heart. The earth had rested in her absence before, and now it would rest again. As Persephone walked among the trees, their leaves crinkling beneath her steps, she felt the sadness of leaving the world of light, but also the quiet peace that came with returning to the realm that had become a part of her. The seasons had brought her back to the surface, but they had also taught her that balance could only be maintained through the continual ebb and flow between life and death, between the warmth of spring and the stillness of winter. With each step toward the underworld, Persephone's heart grew heavy with the weight of the journey, but there was also an acceptance, a quiet knowing that this was the way things must be. Her time in the underworld had changed her. She was no longer the girl who had first been taken by Hades. Now she was a queen, a ruler, a goddess who understood the necessary cycles that bound all things. She had walked the earth as a child of spring, but now she walked as a ruler of the dead, knowing that both roles were part of the same eternal dance. As she approached the gates of the underworld, the familiar cold air washed over her, and the shadows seemed to deepen. It was a place of silence, of peace, but also of isolation. Here, there were no flowers, no warmth from the sun, and no songs of birds. It was a world apart from the earth, a place where the dead found rest, but a place that also held the weight of stillness. Hades stood at the gates, his presence as commanding and silent as always. Though he was a god of death, Persephone had come to see him not just as her captor, but as a companion in the dance between life and death. Their union was not one of love in the way the mortals might have understood it, but it was a partnership forged in the understanding of balance. Together, they ruled the underworld, maintaining the quiet order of death and guiding the souls of the departed. As Persephone crossed the threshold, the gates closed behind her and the air grew still. The earth, in all its splendor, was now far behind her. She was once again in the realm of shadows, where the dead lay in peace, where time stretched out endlessly, and where life's vibrant energy could not reach. But even in the depths of the underworld, Persephone carried with her the wisdom of the earth. The earth, despite its quiet slumber, always awaited her return. The underworld, too, had its role in the great cycle. Though it was cold and dark, it was not an empty place. It held the souls of the departed, those who had once lived, those who had passed, and those who would one day be reborn through the soil of the earth. Persephone's role was to guide them, to show them the way between life and death, between the end and the beginning. Her journey was one of transformation, not just for her, but for the world itself. Her presence in the underworld allowed the earth to rest, just as her return to the surface allowed the earth to awaken. Without the underworld's stillness, there could be no spring. Without spring, the world would remain in a perpetual cycle of dormancy. And so, Persephone moved between these two realms, bringing with her the wisdom of both, understanding that neither life nor death could exist in isolation. They needed each other, and in her they found their unity. As the gates of the underworld closed behind her, Persephone felt the familiar stillness settle around her. The dead, as always, were silent, waiting for her guidance. But even in this silence, she could feel the pulse of the earth, the distant, quiet hum that reminded her that her time on the surface would come again. And with it, the cycle would continue, as it always had. Back on the earth, Demeter felt the absence of her daughter with a pain that ran deeper than the changing of the seasons. As the last of Persephone's light faded from the earth, the world began its quiet descent into winter. The vibrant greens of the fields, once lush with the warmth of spring and summer, dulled to browns and greys. The flowers that had once blossomed beneath Persephone's feet withered, and the once thick trees now stood bare, their branches stretching like skeletal arms toward a clouded sky. Demeter, though strong in her divinity, could not bear the weight of her sorrow alone. She had seen Persephone return every year, and each time it was as though the world itself breathed again. But when the time came for Persephone to leave, when she descended back into the underworld, Demeter's grief took root in the soil itself. It was as if the earth, too, mourned the loss of the goddess of spring. The harvests were forgotten, the crops left to rot in the fields. Mortals called out to Demeter, begging for sustenance, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Demeter could not bear to nurture the earth in the absence of her daughter. With Persephone's departure, the earth seemed to retreat into itself, waiting for the cycle to begin again, when Persephone would return with the warmth of spring. For months, Demeter wandered the earth, her sorrow manifesting in the cold winds and the barren land. She moved from the fields to the mountains, from the cities to the quiet groves, but there was no solace to be found. The earth, in its deepest sadness, seemed to reflect her pain, a reflection of the loss she felt in her very heart. Though Demeter could not stop the seasons, the quiet stillness of winter felt like a betrayal. The warmth of the sun, once so familiar, now felt distant, a memory of what had been. As the days grew shorter and the nights grew longer, Demeter retreated further into herself, unable to shake the feeling that something precious had been lost. Her love for Persephone was the pulse of the earth, the very essence of life itself. And without her daughter, the land felt empty, hollow. In this sorrow, Demeter felt a loneliness she had never known. She knew that her daughter's return was inevitable, that the earth would once again awaken, but the wait, the silent months of winter, seemed endless. As the winds howled through the bare trees, Demeter finally paused and looked up toward the heavens. It was not just the death of the earth she mourned, it was the separation from her daughter. Persephone's presence in her life had been a gift, a light in the midst of all the darkness. Now, without her, Demeter's heart ached with the weight of the quiet, and she could not help but wonder if the earth would ever feel whole again. Her sorrow was not just personal, but a reflection of the rhythm of the world itself. Without Persephone, the earth could not truly live. And so, Demeter grieved not only for her daughter's absence, but for the earth itself, which had slipped into a deep, uncertain slumber. But even as she mourned, Demeter knew that the Earth's cycle would one day return to balance. Her grief, though consuming, was a part of the great cycle of life and death, a cycle that could not be denied. In the depths of winter, Demeter held on to the quiet knowledge that spring would come again, and with it, Persephone's return. For now, Demeter could only wait. The earth would sleep, and she would wait for the moment when her daughter's light would once again fill the land, bringing with it the warmth and life that could not be held back. As the days stretched into months and Demeter's grief continued to shroud the earth, a quiet truth lingered at the edge of all things. The earth, though it lay in slumber, did not forget. Beneath the frozen soil, beneath the barren trees and the withered flowers, life was merely waiting, waiting for the inevitable return of spring, when Persephone would once again grace the earth with her presence. The cycle, though it felt like a heavy weight during the dark months, was never broken. It was as much a part of the universe as the stars in the sky. For while Demeter mourned and the earth rested, the world itself continued its gentle turning, knowing that time would always move forward, and with time, Persephone would return. The life and death of the earth, like all things, moved through endless cycles: birth, growth, death, and rebirth, each phase giving way to the next, unbroken and infinite. The underworld, in its quiet stillness, held Persephone as she took her place beside Hades, her presence a stabilizing force in the shadowed realm. Here, there was no growth, no blooming, no warmth, only the endless stillness of death. And yet, Persephone had come to understand that this too was a part of the balance. The underworld, where souls found their rest, was not a place of decay or destruction. It was a place of transformation, a resting place for those who had lived and died, but who would one day return to the earth in the form of new life. In the quiet shadows of the underworld, Persephone had learned patience. She had learned that her time on the earth, though it felt so short, was not the entirety of her existence. Her journey between two realms was a journey that had no end. The earth, with its blooming fields and sunlit skies, would call to her again when the time was right. But for now, she was where she needed to be. And in this stillness, she had come to understand that the earth's rest was as necessary as its awakening. The time in the underworld, like the time spent on the earth, was part of a sacred rhythm that could not be ignored. When Persephone's heart felt heavy with the waiting, when she longed to return to the light of the earth, she would remind herself of the eternal cycle, the ebb and flow between life and death, light and dark, rest and renewal. She was the keeper of both worlds, a goddess who moved between them with grace and understanding. And though she longed for the warmth of spring, she knew that it was not yet time. There was still a quiet peace to be found in the underworld, in the place where death rested, waiting for the rebirth that would come. The souls in the underworld, too, understood the cycle. Their time in this realm was not an end, but a pause, a quiet space before they would return to the earth. Persephone, in her wisdom, guided them, her presence a reminder that death was not something to be feared. It was simply a part of the great, unending cycle of life. The souls, who once walked the earth, now waited for their rebirth, knowing that their journey had not truly ended. They would return to the earth, bringing new life with them, just as Persephone herself would return. And so, the endless cycle continued. In the underworld, Persephone fulfilled her role as queen, guiding the souls of the departed, overseeing the transition between life and death. On the earth, Demeter continued her sorrowful waiting, but even she knew that the time would come when Persephone would return. The earth's cycle of death and rebirth was never truly halted. Even in the depths of winter, the seeds rested in the earth, waiting for the first signs of spring. And when Persephone returned, the world would awaken once more. Persephone's role, though it seemed solitary at times, was one that bound the two realms together, the world of the living and the world of the dead. She was the key that kept the balance, ensuring that life and death never existed in opposition, but in harmony. Her journey was the constant reminder that nothing lasts forever, not life nor death, but all things are part of a greater cycle, an endless rhythm that connects all things in the universe. And in that understanding, Persephone found peace, not in the warmth of spring alone, nor in the stillness of the underworld, but in the knowledge that both were needed for the world to thrive. The cold winds of winter, though they howled with the sharpness of loss, eventually softened. The earth, though still and barren, had begun to stir beneath its frozen surface. The soil, though hardened by frost, held within it the promise of spring, just as the night held the quiet certainty of the dawn. Time, as always, moved forward, slowly, steadily, inevitably, until the first rays of sunlight began to break through the darkness. In the underworld, Persephone could feel the subtle shift in the air. It was as if the earth had taken a deep breath, as though it, too, was preparing for the return of the light. The very pulse of the underworld seemed to hum in harmony with the earth above. It was a quiet, almost imperceptible feeling, the knowledge that the earth's sleep was drawing to a close, that spring was on the horizon. Persephone, though she resided in the stillness of the underworld, felt the pull of the earth more keenly with each passing day. She had come to understand the delicate balance between life and death, and she knew that her time in the realm of shadows was drawing to an end. The earth would soon awaken, and with it she would return, bringing with her the life and vitality that would restore the balance to the world above. Hades, ever aware of the passage of time, watched his queen with a quiet understanding. Though he was the ruler of the underworld, he too knew the importance of the cycle that Persephone embodied. He had come to respect the rhythm of the earth, and though it pained him to part with her each year, he understood that it was necessary. The earth needed Persephone, just as the underworld needed her presence. Together, they ensured that the great balance of life and death remained intact. As Persephone prepared to leave the underworld, the shadows seemed to part before her. The gates of the realm of the dead opened, and she stepped forward, feeling the warmth of the earth's call. The sun, though it had been hidden for so long, now began to shine more brightly, casting a golden glow across the land. The first stirrings of life began to reach the surface. The soft bloom of flowers, the budding of trees, and the gentle thawing of the rivers. As Persephone made her way toward the earth's surface, she could feel the earth's heartbeat quicken, its pulse growing stronger as she neared. The very soil seemed to welcome her, reaching toward her with the promise of renewal. She could feel the cool, damp earth beneath her feet, but there was no longer the weight of death that had once settled on it. The earth was awakening, spring was returning, and with it, life. Persephone emerged from the depths of the underworld, her presence marking the moment when the earth would come alive again. The air, once cold and still, was now filled with the hum of life. The flowers bloomed, their petals unfurling toward the sun. The trees, once bare, now stood tall with fresh green leaves. The rivers, which had flowed sluggishly through the winter, now surged with renewed strength. The earth was alive once more, and its heartbeat was as steady as the rhythm of the seasons. As Persephone walked through the fields, the earth responded to her presence. The flowers, once dormant, now bloomed in brilliant colors, their fragrance filling the air. The grass, which had been pale and brittle, now grew thick and lush beneath her feet. The earth, in all its vibrancy, seemed to celebrate her return. Persephone, the goddess of spring, had come home. Demeter, sensing the shift in the air, looked toward the horizon, her heart swelling with hope. She had felt the loss of her daughter deeply, and the weight of the earth's sorrow had mirrored her own. But now she felt the stirrings of life once more, the warmth of the sun, the first green shoots of grass. They all spoke to her of Persephone's return. Her heart, once heavy with grief, now swelled with joy as her daughter emerged from the underworld, bringing with her the light of spring. As Persephone and Demeter reunited, the earth seemed to hold its breath in that moment of perfect balance. The cold of winter, though still lingering in the distant corners of the world, was now banished. The warmth of the sun, though it had been absent for so long, now bathed the earth in its light. The seasons had turned once more, and the cycle was complete. Persephone's return was not just the return of spring, it was the return of life itself. The earth, once again, would be nourished by her presence. The flowers would bloom, the trees would bear fruit, and the rivers would flow with renewed vitality. Life, death, and rebirth would continue, as they always had, in the eternal cycle that bound the world together. In the quiet moments of spring's return, Persephone and Demeter stood side by side, their bond stronger than ever. The earth had come alive again, and with it the promise that the cycle would continue. Persephone would return to the underworld when the time was right, but for now she was home, a reminder that light would always return, no matter how dark the winter may seem. With the return of Persephone, the earth was once again bathed in light. The barren fields, once cold and still, now thrummed with the energy of new life. The rivers, once sluggish with the weight of winter, now rushed with fresh vitality. The air, once heavy with frost, was now warm, carrying the fragrance of blooming flowers and the promise of growth. The seasons had turned once more, as they always did, and the balance between life and death was restored. Persephone, though her heart rejoiced in the earth's return to life, could not forget the realm from which she had come. The underworld, though quiet and still, was always a part of her. It was a place of transformation where the souls of the departed found their rest before being reborn into the world. She, as its queen, had learned that death was not an end, but a part of a greater process, a necessary pause before the rebirth of life. As Persephone walked through the vibrant fields, she reflected on the delicate balance she had come to understand. Her time in the underworld had taught her that life and death were not opposing forces, but two halves of the same whole. Without death, life could not exist, and without life, death would have no meaning. It was the eternal cycle that governed all things, the seasons, the land, and the very pulse of the universe. She had come to accept that her journey between the worlds was not one of separation, but of unity. She was both a goddess of spring and a queen of the underworld. Her role in the great rhythm of life and death was to ensure that the cycles remained unbroken. She was the link between these two worlds, and it was in this balance that she found her true purpose. As the days grew longer and the warmth of the sun deepened, Persephone knew that her time on the earth would be brief. The seasons would continue, but eventually the earth would fall into slumber once more. When the winds turned cold and the first frosts appeared, Persephone would return to the underworld, where the quiet darkness would once again embrace her. But for now, she savored the light, knowing that the earth's rest was just as important as its awakening. In the quiet moments of spring, when the earth was alive with vibrant color and life, Persephone could feel the pulse of the world beneath her feet. The flowers, the trees, the rivers, all of them seemed to hum with the energy of life. The earth had come alive once again, and it was a reminder of the eternal cycle that governed all things. Life, death, and rebirth were bound together in a perfect harmony, a dance that would continue forever. Though she had once been a child of the earth, Persephone had come to understand that her role was far greater than she had ever imagined. She was not just a goddess of spring, she was a queen of life and death, a symbol of the endless cycle that bound the living and the dead together. Her journey between the worlds was not just a passage, it was the very essence of the balance that kept the universe in motion. In her time on the earth, Persephone had learned to cherish the fleeting moments of growth, of vitality, of warmth. She knew that the seasons would change, that the flowers would wilt, and that the earth would rest once more. But in the quiet of spring, in the moment of renewal, Persephone found peace. The earth, in all its beauty, would sleep again, and with that sleep would come the promise of new life, new growth, and new beginnings. Her bond with Demeter, her mother, had deepened with each passing cycle. Demeter, though she still felt the pang of loss when Persephone returned to the underworld, now understood the rhythm of the world. She had come to accept that her daughter's departure was not an end, but a necessary part of the cycle. Without Persephone's time in the underworld, there could be no spring. And so, Demeter watched with love and acceptance as her daughter moved between the two realms, knowing that their time together was precious, but also knowing that the world's balance depended on both of them. As the earth bloomed in the warmth of Persephone's return, the world seemed to pause, as though it was holding its breath in the stillness of spring. There was a sense of peace, of harmony that lingered in the air, carried on the breeze that rustled the leaves and the fragrance of flowers. This was the moment of balance, the time when life and death were united, when the cycle continued, and when the earth's heart beat in perfect harmony. But Persephone, as always, knew that this balance could not last forever. The days would grow shorter, the winds would turn cold, and the earth would once again prepare for rest. And when that time came, Persephone would descend once more into the underworld, where the quiet darkness would welcome her return. But for now, she embraced the warmth of the earth, knowing that this moment, like all moments, would pass. The cycle would continue, as it always had, as it always would. Life, death, and rebirth, the eternal rhythm that kept the world in motion. Persephone, the goddess who bridged these two worlds, would continue to move between them, ensuring that the balance remained. And with each return to the earth, each descent into the underworld, she would carry with her the wisdom of both worlds, the understanding that all things are part of the great, unending dance of life. As Persephone's final return to the earth approached, the world once again began to stir with anticipation. The earth, now rich with life, hummed beneath her feet, each step she took causing the world to ripple with the promise of new beginnings. The soil, deep and dark, held the memory of her return, the awakening of spring, the renewal of life, as though it could not forget the rhythm she brought with her. But in her heart, Persephone knew that the cycle she embodied would never cease, nor could it be altered. She was the pulse of the world, the transition between life and death, light and dark. The earth and the underworld were forever linked by her journey, and each cycle that passed added to the wisdom she carried. As both the queen of the underworld and the goddess of spring, Persephone stood as a living symbol of the dance between these two forces. With each passing season, Persephone's role had grown clearer, more defined. She was not just a goddess of spring, nor merely a ruler of death. She was the bridge between the two, a force that ensured the flow of life would continue undisturbed, as it had since time immemorial. In her, the cycle found its true meaning, a continual exchange between opposites, a rhythm that moved not just in nature, but in the heart of every living being. Her time on the earth was always fleeting, but it was a time of vibrancy and growth. Flowers bloomed, trees budded, and the very air seemed to sing with the energy of life. Yet Persephone knew that all things must eventually fade. Her return to the underworld would soon come again, bringing with it the peace of winter when the earth would rest. It was a rest that was necessary, not just for the earth, but for all that lived within it. And when Persephone returned to the underworld, she carried with her the knowledge of the earth's seasons, the knowledge of life's eternal renewal. The souls in the underworld, once departed from the earth, rested there in quiet anticipation, waiting to be reborn. The underworld, though a realm of shadows, was just as much a part of life as the earth above. And Persephone, as its queen, ruled with the understanding that death was not an end, but a momentary rest before the return to life. Each time she descended, it was not with sorrow, but with the recognition that the earth needed its time of sleep. Her role in the great rhythm of the world was to keep the cycles turning, unbroken and unceasing. It was a dance that would go on forever, a never-ending flow of life, death, and rebirth. And Persephone, with her deep wisdom, knew that her place in this cycle was eternal. As the earth slowly began to cool, the first signs of autumn began to make their presence known. The once lush fields began to fade into hues of amber and gold, and the winds carried with them the scent of change. Persephone's heart, ever tied to the rhythm of the earth, recognized the quiet shift. The days, though still warm, were beginning to grow shorter, the nights longer. The time was coming for her to return to the underworld, to resume her role in the realm of the dead. Demeter, though she felt the pain of Persephone's departure, had learned to embrace the eternal cycle. She, too, understood that life must rest in order to be reborn. The earth would sleep, and when Persephone returned, it would awaken with a renewed vigor. The seasons, though ever-changing, would continue as they always had. The bond between mother and daughter remained unbroken, a testament to the strength of their connection and the cycles that bound them together. And so, with the changing of the seasons, Persephone prepared to leave the earth once more. But even as the first chill of winter whispered through the trees, she knew that her departure was only temporary. The earth would rest, but it would not remain dormant forever. When the warmth of spring returned, so too would she. The eternal dance would continue, as it always had, an unbroken rhythm, a never-ending cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Persephone's journey, though it spanned lifetimes, was not one of separation, but of unity. She was the embodiment of the balance between life and death, light and dark, and in this understanding she found peace. Her time in the underworld was not a punishment, but a part of the great rhythm that governed all things. The earth's awakening and its rest were as necessary as the souls that passed into the underworld, waiting for their return. In the dance between the two realms, Persephone found her purpose. As she descended once more into the shadows, she did so with the quiet understanding that life would always return to the earth. The cycle would continue. The seasons would turn, the flowers would bloom, and the earth would breathe again, just as she had always done. And with each return, Persephone would bring life to the earth once more. The eternal dance of life, death, and rebirth was unbroken, a rhythm that would continue forever. And Persephone, with her dual existence, was the living embodiment of this dance. The goddess who walked between two worlds, ensuring that the cycle would always turn. And so, the journey of Persephone, goddess of both spring and death, has come to its close. Her story is one of profound wisdom, a reminder that life and death are not opposites, but parts of the same eternal cycle. Through her, we understand that each season, each cycle of nature, brings both renewal and rest, life and quiet. Persephone's role, both as the queen of the underworld and the goddess of spring, reminds us that all things are connected by a rhythm beyond our control, and that balance is essential to the world. As the seasons turn and the earth rests in quiet anticipation, let us remember Persephone's journey, her timeless dance between light and dark, life and death, and how through each cycle the world continues to turn. Through every ending there is a new beginning, and through every season of loss there is always the promise of rebirth. May Persephone's story, her wisdom, and her eternal journey guide us as we navigate the seasons of our own lives.